This is Dimitri Lascaris reporting for the Real News Network from Paris, France, and the United Nations COP21 Climate Conference. This is the second part of our report on the public trial of Exxon-Mobil at the People's Climate Summit in Montreuil, just outside of Paris, France, during the weekend preceding the high-level negotiations at COP21. In our first segment, we heard from glaciologist Jason Box and also from climate activist Ken Henshaw from Social Action Nigeria. We're now going to hear some of the testimony of Dr. Sandra Steinbreger of Concerned Physicians of New York in relation to the deleterious effects of the activities of the fracking industry. And here's some of what she had to say at the public trial of Exxon.
You are a specialist in the impacts of fracking. Could you tell us about Exxon's involvement in the fracking industry in the United States?
Sure. So Exxon is the world's largest public natural gas producer, and it extracts oil and gas via fracking all over the world, particularly in the United States, but more recently it's gone after the shale gas and oil in Argentina.
We've talked a lot about local health impacts of Exxon's activities, and we'll come to that, but I also would like to ask you about the climate impacts of fracking, since we are here outside a climate conference. Sometimes natural gas gets marketed as a climate solution. Is that the case based on your expertise?
Natural gas is a climate problem. In fact, it's a catastrophe for the climate. So in addition to the deceptions that Exxon-Mobil has precipitated regarding the actual existence of climate change and the role of fossil fuels, Exxon is also implicit in promulgating the idea that somehow natural gas is a more friendly fossil fuel than the other two members of the unholy trinity, oil, gas, and coal. And they continue to perpetuate this misconception. As a member of Concerned Health Professionals of New York, we're a group of scientists, physicians, nurses, and we have watchdogged the evidence for the harms and risks of fracking since 2012, following the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And we've taken a look at the health harms of fracking, but also the climate harms. And the scientific research on this is now growing exponentially. So our first iteration of this compilation, our compendium of the findings on the risks and harms of fracking, was released a year and a half ago, and there were a few hundred studies that we reviewed. Our most current issue, which we just released in October, now has more than 500 studies, and the vast majority of these, more than 85%, show risks and harms both to people and to the climate. And so for the record, I would like to read from our compendium the summary on fracking's effect on the climate.
And we can submit the entire report into evidence.
So methane is, we now know, the evidence shows it's a much more potent greenhouse gas than formerly appreciated. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates that over a 20-year time frame, methane can, pound for pound, trap 86 times more heat than carbon dioxide. And real-world leakage rates greatly exceed earlier estimates. In the heavily drilled Barnett Shale in northeastern Texas, methane emissions were shown to be 50% higher than earlier estimates by the EPA. Fracking operations and associated infrastructure contribute to 71 to 85% of methane emissions in the region.
Would you mind if we entered this into evidence? Do you have a copy of this?
Yes, I'd be happy to introduce this. Yep.
Thank you. One final question. Since this is, you've been an activist on this issue, and people often discount activists. What did the Commissioner of Health for the state of New York say last year when he announced his decision on fracking?
We announced a ban on fracking after the health commissioner did a careful review and discovered that no regulatory framework could effectively prevent the leakage of methane and other harmful chemicals from drilling and fracking operations. The science that has come out since that our health commissioner has made his announcement has only corroborated and extended that analysis.
And do you remember wasn't the phrase he used that he would not let his family live near a fracking?
That's right.
Well,
so Dr. Zucker made an extraordinary statement when the health review was released from the Department of Health in saying that that he would not feel comfortable raising a family next to a fracking site. And therefore, given that all of the people of New York are essentially his patients, he could not advocate anyone living near there, and therefore it should not happen at all.
When you learned that the CEO of Exxon had opposed a fracking well in his neighborhood in Texas, how did that make you feel?
Well, Rex Tillerson objected to the loss of property value that fracking infrastructure would create in the very fine area where he lived. And in fact, he was right to say so. And the economic data show that when fracking comes to a community, property values go down, social blight goes up. So that's maybe the one thing Rex Tillerson is correct about.
Thank you very much.
One last question. You are a mother of 2 children. You have written about motherhood and the responsibilities to future generations. When you learned that Exxon had been researching climate change since the 1970s, research that has been described here today as state-of-the-art, did you have a reaction as a mother or as a scientist? Up to you, or both?
I immediately had a reaction as a scientist because I myself was studying climate change and what we then called the greenhouse effect as early as 1977 when I was first introduced to it by my biology professor. So we in the scientific community have known about the reality of climate change for a long time. As a mother, I know that there's no bigger threat to my children than the dissolving climate. And the disinformation campaign, perpetuated by many, but most notably Exxon, makes it difficult for me to do my job as a mother. I believe that all tasks of parenthood fall into one of 2 categories. We are called upon to plan a future for our children and to keep them safe from harm. And climate change makes that impossible, makes both of those tasks impossible. So climate change, the climate crisis is really a parenting crisis, which is to say it's a human rights crisis. And for Exxon to be involved in the disinformation about the science of climate, which we in biology have known about since the 1970s, is a strike against parenthood and a strike against human knowledge and scientific progress.
After hearing from Dr. Steinbrager and glaciologist Jason Box and Ken Henshaw from Social Action Nigeria and various other witnesses, including and particularly from frontline communities, the prosecutors Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben delivered their summations to the 3-judge panel, following which the 3-judge panel issued its verdict to the court.
It's hard to imagine a set of corporate practices that could have done more damage and more damage needlessly, since Exxon knew, as we now know, early on, precisely what the problem that we faced was, the crisis that we faced. That crisis has grown over those 25 years. But over those 25 years, Exxon continued to maintain that architecture and ecosystem of denial and deception and disinformation. And for that, we ask for a judgment against Exxon and in favor of the future of this planet.
So we aren't asking you to put a price on that which is priceless. We have heard stories of lives lost directly because of melting ice. We have heard stories of ancient cultures threatened because of climate change. We have heard stories of the most reckless and discriminatory disregard for human life and human well-being and human health. It is Exxon's crime that it believes that money trumps life, trumps everything. So we aren't going to try to do the same thing. There is no price that can be placed on the Marshall Islands, on Arctic cultures, on the lives of our loved ones, on what we are unable to pass on to our children. But we have a duty to seek justice, and that is what we ask of you in rendering your verdict. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, to the witnesses who testified today, we thank you for your service. We know that the subjects you were asked to discuss are difficult. They involve the future of the people and places that you love. Your willingness to testify here today helps with the push towards justice. And we hope that compensates in some way for all of the hardship involved. So, we render our verdict as follows.
Given that as a court we lack the ability to compel testimony from Exxon, we are unable to reach a conclusive finding of guilt or innocence. The majesty of the law demands, of course, that a defendant be able to offer exculpatory evidence. However, we can ask that other courts in other jurisdictions that have the power to summon this company before the law do so, and with haste. The testimony is compelling that Exxon's business methods and practices have caused loss and damage to those who live nearby. The testimony is compelling that Exxon's decision to deny climate change and work against climate action has dramatically escalated one of the deepest crises humans have ever faced. The testimony is compelling that that crisis is already putting lives, cultures, and indeed entire nations at risk. A risk that will steadily grow in the years ahead.
If examinations by other authorities are able to document the pattern of abuse suggested by today's testimony, we judge that this will represent one of, and perhaps the most remarkable instance of corporate crime in human history. We note that even as we meet delegates from around the world are assembled in this city trying to work it out at this late date, some kind of governmental response to climate change, we note as well that their efforts continue to be hampered by climate denial and deception. We find the evidence persuasive and compelling that had Exxon 25 years ago merely stated publicly what its scientists already concluded, notably that climate change was real and perilous and demanded immediate action, then the world would have moved far more quickly and decisively, and extraordinary damage could have been avoided. We add in our capacity as individual judges that the burden of proof now rests squarely on this corporation to somehow prove that the documents and memos don't show what prima facie they seem to demonstrate, namely a profound disregard for the safety of the planet and its people. We render this verdict unanimously on the 5th of December 2015, the hottest year yet measured on our Earth.
And so the public trial of Exxon-Mobil, the world's largest publicly traded oil and gas company, concluded in Montreuil during COP21 with a damning verdict of the three-judge panel. But this court was at best a court of public opinion. The real fate of Exxon-Mobil now lies in the hands of those who have sworn to enforce and to uphold the law. This is Dimitri Lascaris reporting from Paris, France in the COP21 Climate Conference for the Real News Network.